Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Today's topic is tips for preventing recalls due to undeclared allergens, and today's guest presenter is David Rosenblatt, Head of Learning and Academic Services at Share Consulting and Training. Morning, well, it's actually good afternoon, David. How are you?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly. Can hear you. I've not seen you for a while, but your presentations are always fantastic. So looking forward to a good one. You can see in the sidebar, everybody, tell us where you're joining from. They're already doing it. They don't need me to ask. Dominic from Suffolk, Mayank from India, James from Augusta, Genevieve from Philippines. Look at that. Truly global. Okay, I'm going to play the sponsor ads now, and we'll be back for David's presentation in a couple of minutes. Okay, I'll be back for the Q&A later, but for now, I'll hand you over to David.
Okay, I'm going to keep my video on for a second there, and then I'll let you watch the presentation. I want to thank you, Simon, again for inviting me, and thank all of you for joining us. Those of you who have not met me, my name is David. I'm with Share Consulting and Training. We are part of the Merion Nutri Sciences company, group of companies. And this year is my 30th year in dealing with food safety. I'm a veterinarian, and I feel privileged to be able to be involved in this really, really important community of people who are passionate about ensuring the safety of our food chain throughout the world. And I'm also excited to see people from all over the world joining us. And every time I meet colleagues, I'm excited to be able to share some information and answer some questions. And feel free to keep in touch if you have any questions after we finish that you didn't have time to for me to answer. Or if you're watching this later on YouTube and you want to reach out, feel free. I'd be happy to be available to answer questions. Today's subject, I'm going to turn off my video and you're able to watch the presentation. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about a subject that's we speak about it often. I'll show you some statistics and to see how prevalent this is. So I'm not really going to dump a lot of new stuff on you today. No novel, a little bit, but not really something that you'll say, oh my God, I never knew that. Well, maybe you will, but probably not. What I want to do is offer a methodological approach to this challenge to prevent recalls of undeclared ingredients, because not only are undeclared ingredients and these recalls bad for our business, they also can actually cause real harm to people, including death. True, the vast majority of the population in the world couldn't care less. It has nothing to do with them. Most people can eat an undeclared ingredient, and besides maybe it affecting their sense of autonomy, that they were fed something that they didn't know they were getting, it has no effect on their health. Those few people in the world who can become seriously ill from being exposed to an ingredient that's not registered, that's not written on the label, are the people we care about. These are the people that are important to us. So yeah, the prevalence is not like the people being affected is not like salmonellosis or listeriosis or other issues that have an effect on large parts of the population, but it's still a really, really important issue, both economically and also, in my opinion, ethically. And another thing that I want to mention, and I'm not going to go into it when we talk about ethics, is there has been a trend around the world of over labeling. Manufacturers saying, I don't want to take a chance. I don't want to harm somebody inadvertently, and so I'm going to put in warning on my label. This may contain, and it's now done very freely and sometimes recklessly. This may contain, and it's not always justified. And it's important to understand that those people among us who are allergic to food or have a condition, maybe favism, or maybe they have celiac disease, or allergic to food, these people are people that have a handicap, some type of handicap, and they cannot do whatever everybody else does without engendering their life. And properly labeling our foods and making sure they don't contain or are not labeled as may contain recklessly prevents these people from access to our foods. People with a food allergy should be able to enjoy food like everybody else. Of course, if I have a peanut allergy, then okay, I can't eat products with peanuts. I understand that. That's my destiny until I get a cure. But why shouldn't I be able to enjoy other products that don't have peanuts when they say may contain peanuts if it's not justified? So I want people to start to think about over labeling, over warning as something that we should be refraining from doing from an ethical point of view to make our food accessible, because it's not going to be economical. We can afford not to have those people buy our products. We'll manage. There's not that many of them that it's going to be a problem. But somebody who wants to, make his restaurant accessible to somebody who is on a wheelchair has the same issue. You're not going to make money doing that. It's the right thing to do. So the right thing to do is make our food accessible. So make sure we don't have undeclared ingredients. That's my view on this. Now let's get into the presentation. So I'm going to use this next slide. So what are we going to be talking about in the next few minutes? What's our agenda for this time? I'm going to mention the prevalence just because we have some up-to-date information that I can share with you. But I'm going to then get right into undeclared ingredient risk assessment. And this whole presentation is going to be from a risk assessment point of view. And I do that sometimes in these presentations when I participate in the Food Safety Friday initiative. I'll often approach an issue through the risk assessment, which is the right thing to do, and I'll explain to you why. So when we talk about risk assessment, we'll be talking about identification, evaluation, and control, the three aspects of a risk assessment, and how each one of them should be addressed when we're talking about the hazard of an undeclared ingredient, potential hazard. So how common is it? Myriad NutriSciences, our parent company, every year published the blue paper that's available for our customers and for our in-house use. And we have the benefit of having laboratories all around the world in more than 27 countries. So we have access to a lot of data, and the blue paper uses that data to do risk assessments and analysis that we can then make available to our customers. So when looking at the 2022 blue paper, 2023, we don't have yet. And then look at how common it is. Well, 21,132 notifications of food safety issues. And when we get a little closer to that, we can see that allergens are a large proportion of that. And the allergens are up by 45%. and allergens, including gluten, which is not a true allergen, but we still include it in the undeclared ingredient problems. And these percentages are significant. And we also, we look at for instance, we look at recalls. Let's look at that for a second. Food product recalls, and we look at how many recalls are due to different subjects, different types. Then in Europe, 12% of recalls are because of undeclared ingredients. In the United States, is up to 38%, much more than in Europe. So over 1/3 of the recalls in the world are due to undeclared ingredients, which is crazy. And almost 100% of them are preventable. I participate in many investigations into recalls after they happen, using investigative tools to try to figure out what happened, what went wrong, how it could have been prevented, and how to put in place preventive actions to prevent recurrence of the issue. And almost, I mean, every once in a while, there's something you say, wait, no, we had an issue, a recall of honey recently, and it had undeclared milk protein in it, and people who had a milk allergy or allergic to milk reacted to the honey. So it turned out that the beekeeper that was keeping the bees was feeding the bees with whey, which is a milk-based ingredient, and the bees were regurgitating the milk protein back into the honey. This is an issue. But at the end of the investigation, we found that the company who was doing the risk assessment for the honey could not have predicted that. That was something that from now on we will. From now on that we know that could happen, then of course we'll be predicting it. But it was something that couldn't have been prevented. But besides things like that, which are really little crazy little idiosyncrasies, the vast majority of undeclared ingredient cases are totally preventable once we understand what went wrong. And had the risk assessment done its job, what it was supposed to have done, which is identify, evaluate, and control, we wouldn't have been in that situation. This is true both because this is a food recall situation that we're talking about, but it's also true for the food service industry, food service industry has even more of in my opinion, of a challenge in making their products accessible, because in the food service sector, restaurants, coffee shops, fast food joints, we're not talking about prepackaged products that can be properly controlled. The control has to be done in real time in the kitchen. And also we have information about the types of allergens that are responsible for a lot of these recalls. And we see that milk, eggs, and wheat are the number one, as they are prevalent, as the allergy to these allergens are more prevalent in the population. So that's just a little bit about where we are in the world, and we are seeing it growing. By the way, a few days ago, FDA, I read an article, FDA has now authorized a drug that can be used to treat food allergies. This drug has been around for a while, and it's a biological drug using antibodies to control allergies. It's now been approved for food safety for food allergies. So we'll see how that happens in the future. Maybe there's a turning point around the corner. Okay, so some recommendations. Now we're getting into practice take-home things. So it is recommended to appoint one food safety team member to assume the role of what we call your food safety and intolerance specialist. So if you are doing a risk assessment, and imagine you have your HACCP team or your risk assessment team, and you have your team leader, and then you have your team members. So you have this person who's representative from maintenance, and somebody from production, and somebody from product development, somebody from QA. This is your food safety team. We recommend appointing one of these people on the team to be the food safety or the food allergy, and intolerance specialist. So what does this person do? This is the person who we send to learn, organize, and present the professional material regarding food allergies and intolerances. They will be the one who subscribes to information sources. This is the person who participates in learning activities. So you'd send them to the webinar, send them to the seminar. This is the person that interacts with external labs and specialists, choosing the right laboratory practices, understanding threshold levels, and interacts with product development, with marketing, with legal, with operations. So we have an expert on our team. Now, this is not the expert. Of course, this is the person who can then consult with the external experts if need be. with universities or with people who are higher degrees, but we have that way we can keep our resources tight. So we don't have to have everybody learning everything all the time. And in larger organizations, it's really also very efficient, because if you have big companies that may have 3, 4, 5 factories, and there's a lot of information, so you have one person who goes and does all that. Of course, that person should not be alone, because when they're gone, when they're not there anymore, or they have to leave for any reason, we have to have somebody be able to step into their shoes. So they should have somebody who works with them, but that would be our specialist. So it's something recommended, not mandatory in any way. Now we get to the risk assessment approach. So I want to remind you, you've seen this slide. If you've seen my presentations in the past, you've seen this slide. This is a slide that is relevant for all food safety issues. Whenever we're managing food safety risk, we have to identify, evaluate, control. 100% of food safety issues that we're dealing with that shouldn't have happened, that we're sorry that happened, and we investigate them, we will always be able to, if you do a good investigation, find what went wrong. And the fault is always in the risk assessment. Either we failed to identify the potential, therefore it happened because we couldn't evaluate it because we hadn't identified it, and we're just surprised that it happened. Not identifying a potential hazard is terrible. Again, as I said in the example of the milk and honey, every few years we do come across a new novel risk that we hadn't been aware of before. I've been in my 30 years I've been doing this, I've had a few of those that I've been through, including the most recent one. But I remember the Chronobacter sakazaki incident in France, where we learned that Chronobacter sakazaki, that bacteria, could be a pathogen for small infants. It was not known before that to be pathogenic. I remember when we learned about melamine as a risk in the early 2000s. So every once in a while, there will be a novel new risk in anything, but putting that aside, 99.99% of things that could happen are we can imagine them happening. We can identify them. And so that's one issue. Another issue is that if the hazard has been identified, sometimes it's not properly evaluated, and either because we don't evaluate its severity properly, or we don't evaluate the likelihood properly, and that combination, our conclusion in the risk assessment is, this identified potential hazard, its risk is not high enough to justify a control measure. So that's what ISO 22000 is talking about. That's what FSMA talks about. Identify and evaluate to differentiate between those potential hazards that are significant and those that are not significant. The ones that are not significant do not warrant a critical control point, or a preventive control, or an OPRP, or whatever preventive control we're using. So therefore, it could be that we did a miscalculation evaluation. I'm going to present briefly a tool that gives us an opportunity to evaluate the risk of allergy, which is something that is very helpful to many food safety teams. And finally, in the most tragic cases, in my opinion, the risk was identified, it was evaluated to be significant, and control did not work. So we have to understand that controls, have to be effective. So we must be able to validate our controls to make sure that we're not applying control that at the end of the day won't be effective, but also has to be verified to make sure that it's actually being implemented as we expect it to be implemented. So we'll talk a little bit about the possible control measures that we can be using for different types of situations that have been identified as causing a risk for an undeclared ingredient. So let's go into the assessment. So we'll begin with identify according to the sequence of events. And the first type of hazards we must identify are supply chain hazards. This is hazards. This is true for all risk, but especially for undeclared ingredient risk, because now we're talking about those cases where the undeclared ingredient was carried over from our supplier, survived throughout our process, and was sold to the public. Like somebody who makes a product with honey, and they buy the honey, and the honey has the milk protein in it, So the supplier, it's a supply chain issue and so forth. We see a lot of them. So make sure what we're going to do now, make sure when you go through your checklist, make sure when you go through your risk assessment that you have identified these potential risks because they've happened. So these hazards. So printing errors, these are printing errors that happen usually at our packaging material supplier, whoever supplies the packaging material. Undeclared ingredient and a component of the product. So that means that we're buying an ingredient and that has an undeclared ingredient in that ingredient. Now, this is really common. And sometimes our supplier will say, listen, okay, you want to buy maize. So you're making a maize-based snack. And the supplier may say, listen, I cannot guarantee that my maize does not contain any wheat. I cannot guarantee that my maize does not contain any peanut or any, maybe it has some soy in it. I can't. So, but that's my product. Take it or leave it. And sometimes I can't afford to buy an ingredient that's more pure. The question is, how risky is it? So it must be identified. The potential has to be identified. We cannot ignore it. Once it's identified, now we have a tool, and I'm going to get to that, that will allow us to assess, is this an issue that must be taken into consideration in our risk assessment, or can we say, okay, this is a calculated risk that we can take, depending on the amount of expected allergen that can be carried over from that specific material. And the big major issue that I've already made reference to is cross contact in the agricultural sector. So many of these undeclared ingredients are coming from regular factories, but some of them are coming from commodities that are being bought agricultural sector, where there is a big challenge to find agricultural products, crops that are allergen free, or maybe sometimes we overlook the potential of allergen cross contact in the field. So I just want to talk a little bit about that when we do our risk assessment. So we need to do an agricultural risk assessment. It has to be done. If we are buying raw materials from agricultural sector, we don't have to do it ourselves, but we can participate and we can influence. But if we're going to be purchasing agricultural ingredients, we must make sure that whoever we're buying from is doing their agricultural risk assessment. So even when we do an audit for a supplier, we want to see how they've done their risk assessment. They've taken into consideration these specific situations. One situation that has been overlooked, and we've seen cases. By the way, every single one of these items on this checklist of potential hazards, there have been cases. Every single one of them, I can cite cases that have happened. None of these are imaginary. So crop rotation is an issue. Sometimes, for instance, there was a case with peanut contamination in garlic powder, because garlic and peanuts are grown in the same type of agricultural environment, and these crops are often rotated. So I can have in one season, I can be harvesting my garlic, which is going to be an ingredient in my garlic powder, and there may be leftover peanuts from the previous season, sometimes in the equipment, but sometimes just because it's in that field. This has to be taken into consideration when we do the risk assessment. Adjacent crops are also an issue, of course. So this is carryover with wind, with animals that we can have. That's why we see often that there'll be wheat contamination in maize, because these are crops that are often grown adjacently and so forth. Soy sometimes we'll see contamination with. So it's something to do with, we have to do our assessments. Farming equipment. And this can be surprising because sometimes I don't have that specific ingredient anywhere near me, but I am now having, for my harvest, I've hired a company to bring their equipment over, and they've last week worked on a different farm, different area, and I didn't do that risk assessment, and they're not aware of it, and they're bringing in their equipment with contaminants from a different field. The whole issue of collection and storage, the bins, the warehouses, all have to be considered, and of course, employees. Many of the people in the world who are who work for in the farm industry, the farm people, are not highly educated. Sometimes they're migrant workers. Sometimes they don't know the language, and sometimes it's difficult to train and explain and put them and get them on board, which is something we have to do. So we'll use multi-language training, and we'll use different explanations to try to make people aware, because you have to understand, and this is something that we'll mention in control. Most people, the whole issue of cross contact doesn't make sense. What are you telling me? That if a single peanut will enter into this product, somebody can die? It doesn't make sense, because for most people, this disease is not real to them. So it's really important what we call employee awareness. And another thing in agricultural risk assessment is packing houses, of course, which in my opinion are food factories, but sometimes their management systems are under global gap instead of under FSCC 22000. So we want to make sure our packing houses are also aware and doing risk assessments for their produce. Two resources that I want to encourage you to look at. The Allergen Bureau, which I'm going to mention later, which is a great organization, have put out a free resource called Assessing Agricultural Cross Contact. And the Spice Association is also, the Seasoning Spice Association also wrote guidance on allergen risk assessment models. These are both pretty new documents. I have put a QR code here. If you want, you can take your smartphone. I'll wait for 30 seconds. And you can scan these, and you'll be able to download these documents directly if you want to be high-techy about it. If you don't, you can also go and look for it online. And if somebody, for any reason, doesn't manage to find these, please send me an email. I'll send you the document. I have them on PDF. So I'll do a few of these as we go along, so I have some resources that you can scan, and they should download onto your phone, and then you can share them and use them. We use these tools when we do risk assessments for purchases, for people who purchase agricultural produce to reduce the chances of these types of incidents. So we did a risk assessment for our agricultural risk assessment. Now we're talking about for our purchasing and agriculture, and I'll talk about a little bit of processing risk assessment. This is all already within the factory. So one issue is of course cross contact between products. This must be looked at very carefully when we do a risk assessment. Identify all potential contacts. I investigated a case recently in a factory that makes condiments, and in one of their condiments, they discovered egg residue, and it was not any. They had separate lines. It was not anywhere near it. They couldn't understand where it was coming from, and we found that there was cross contact between products happening through the ventilation ducts. They had dust that was carrying over egg protein, and they actually had to redo that in order to prevent that from happening again. And they missed it in their risk assessment. They didn't think about it. Residue from former product, of course, if we're making a product with an allergen, without an allergen on the same line, then when we finish making the product with the allergen and we're moving over to the product without the allergen, next, then we have to do an allergen clean. That would be our control measure. So we have to identify the potential for that happening. And introduction of external material, which is something that has nothing to do with contact between products or residue from another product, but coming from the outside totally. So we have to think about that as well. Our employees, can employees bring in material? Can it be coming in with our packaging material? Can we be introducing external allergens from guests or maybe our subcontractors who are working in the factory? And also, and this is and labeling issues is the number one cause. 1/3 of all of the recalls with the undeclared ingredients are done not because of cross contact or because of purchasing issues, supply chain issues, but because of labeling mistakes. So labeling justifies a dedicated risk assessment just for labeling. And we should be looking at the label design. Sometimes the mistake is when we design the label, we should be looking at printing errors that can be happening. Sometimes organizations print their own labels online. Sometimes they're printed by their printing company or by their packaging material company. Packaging material errors. So sometimes the packaging material manufacturer, when they package the packaging material in its boxes or in its whatever packaging, they'll make a mistake and they'll have a mix-up in their factory. Storage of packaging material errors, storing them in the wrong places, and errors in marking. So it says on the box on the outside that this is what the label is, but on the inside there's something else. And issuing errors, which is very common. Issuing is when you have your packaging material warehouse or area, and you're going to next packaging campaign, and you issue the packaging material for that campaign. There's somebody's job is to say, okay, here are your bottles, here are your bins, or this is your laminate. And when you issue that, they can issue the wrong packaging material. So these are all potential issues that must be looked at. And finally, packaging mix-ups and mismatches. Mix-ups are where we put the wrong product in the wrong package. Mismatches are where we have two packaging components that have different writing on them, and they get mixed up. So we'll put one product's cover or lid on a different product's body, and that mismatch will also can cause undeclared ingredient issues. So these should all be identified in the risk assessment as potential, and then go on to evaluate the severity and likelihood, and finally we'll see what controls we should have in place for that. We can also see cases of unintentional disinformation that are not on the label, but on the company website, on social media, that should also be controlled and be looked at. Make sure that we identify potentials that are coming from those places, from other written materials, brochures, recipes, and finally, customer service representatives. We have to identify potential there as well. People call, people write up, people go onto social media, and they come in contact with people who are customer service representatives. They're not necessarily food safety specialists. They may be asked questions. They may be giving misinformation. So this is something that also should be identified as a potential for causing somebody to be exposed to an undeclared ingredient. So that was just a list of our checklist of, are we identifying all of these potential issues? And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's pretty good. So go back home, look at your risk assessments and see if you have covered all of these potential things in your risk assessment. It may not be justified to be doing anything about it right now, because it is a risk assessment. It may be potential that you say, okay, that could happen. Okay, let's evaluate it and then decide not to control. That's fine. That's why we do risk assessments. That's their job. But not to have identified it at all is unacceptable. Now we come to evaluation. And evaluation in when we're talking about undeclared ingredients is pretty tricky, because the severity is usually considered to be the highest possible, because you look at the worst case scenario, anaphylactic shock, somebody eating the product and dropping dead. So it's up there with Listeria monocytogenes, with E. coli 015787. It's up there with the deadly. But is it? In all occasions, can we not have tools that will say, well, maybe in this case, the severity is not as high as it would have been had there been more of the product? And also looking at our likelihoods, how likely is this to happen? What are the statistics? So I want to present to you just briefly and encourage you, if you've heard about this and using it, fine. If you haven't heard about it and you're not using it, think about it. The Allergen Bureau for years has been offering the VITAL program, and it updates itself. We're now on version 3.1. The Allergen Bureau, it's called VITAL is the acronym for Voluntary Incidental Trace Allergen Labeling Program. And what it is, it's a tool that allows you to take allergen by allergen, ingredient by ingredient, cross-contact by cross-contact, very meticulously putting into a calculation, saying, okay, what is the residual amount of allergen expected in this specific situation? We assess it. And then what the tool does, what this program does, it takes into consideration all of the scientific data available on threshold reactions to different allergens. And every different allergen we know has different threshold levels of reaction, of trigger. And it helps you calculate what is the expected rate of inclusion of a certain allergen in your final product. So for instance, let's say I'm making cookies and I have a supplier supplying me with wheat, with flour. And I'm concerned that my cookies are supposed to be safe for people who suffer peanut allergy. And my supplier says, listen, we have found residue of peanuts in our flour when we do screening, when we do ELISA, when we do PCR, we found it, and we know what levels we're looking at. Should you or should you not label your cookies with may contain peanuts? I don't want to write may contain peanuts. I want people who suffer from peanut allergy to be able to enjoy my cookies. But of course, if there may be peanuts there, I don't want them to die. So I want to make the right decision. This is a risk assessment. So I will take the information, how much of the flour is going to be in the cookie, and how much allergen, that's allergen, I do expect to be, in the worst case scenario, in the flour. And the Vital program will help me decide at different levels of confidence if I need or do not need to label my product with a may contain. And it's a great program. You do register, have to do a subscription. You should subscribe to them. It costs some money, and there are different programs. Go online, look at it. And did I do a barcode for that? I think I did. Wait a second. Okay, so this is just what it is. The Vital 3.1 program is a standardized allergen risk assessment process for food manufacturers. Helps them evaluate the impact of allergen cross-contact in their products and to provide appropriate precautionary allergen labeling, what we call PAL, for consumers. So it's a great tool. Did I not do it? Yeah, there you go. If you scan this, it'll take you to their website, and you can look out the different programs. They have training, they have certification, the tools are ongoing, a lot of great information, and it's a really great tool for people who are in charge of doing the risk assessment in their organization to evaluate what is the potential impact of that specific allergen. So I really like it. It's not for everybody, and it is recognized by major regulatory bodies, which is important. Both EFSA and FDA recognize that if you use a Vital program type of thinking when you make your decisions and you show that numbers, you show the calculations, it is acceptable to the regulators as a risk assessment tool. And finally, we'll spend the next few minutes talking about control measures. This is going to be a recap a little bit because when we talk about identify, I did mention some of the control measures, but now what we need to make sure is in place when we're controlling our risks. I do want to just remind us, control is defined in ISO 22000 as control measure is anything we do that can prevent or reduce recognize significant hazard to an acceptable level. And this is what we're talking about, because acceptable levels for allergens we usually think to be zero, but they're not. There are acceptable levels, different threshold levels in the final product that should be taken into consideration depending on the level of confidence that I'm looking for. And so this is true for different undeclared ingredients. Of course, we have undeclared ingredients that are more, for instance, gluten is more tolerable to have residual amounts than, for instance, milk, depending on what the sufferer is suffering from. So we'll go through now. So we talked about identifying supply chain hazards. Now we talk about controlling supply chain hazards. This includes not buying anything from anybody that has a significant risk if they are not certified to a GFSI benchmark food safety management system. That's a recommendation. It's not a requirement. It's something I think is good practice. So I like GFSI benchmark food safety management systems, but I also like when you add on a high-level second-party audit. So I've spoken about this in a previous webinar that we did on purchasing practices. I'll show you a reference to that in a minute. I believe in the system of third-party certification, but I think it's important that responsible buyers don't rely solely on their third-party certifications, but also have people of their own doing a second-party audit and making sure whoever's doing that knows what they're doing. This is not true for every supplier, for every hazard. It's true for those hazards that can cause catastrophe. Monitoring and/or verification by ingredient screening. We do have a lot of options now, and we're getting better and better at it to do ingredient screening. We have kits that can look at the amount or the presence of different allergens using ELISA. We have systems that use PCR, and laboratories are coming out with more and more ways of identifying undeclared ingredients by laboratory analysis. Check in with your laboratory analysis supplier, whoever you're working with, your provider, and see what's new, see what's going on, see what can be added onto your portfolio of tools that you're using to do screening when you're bringing in ingredients that you may not be 100% sure about. So I do want to refer you to a webinar that I gave a few years ago called Good Purchasing Practices. and it's on YouTube, and you can scan it, and you can go back and watch this if you want. And it does like a double click on the subject and talks in general about ways to manage the big challenge of our supply chain hazards, things that could be coming from our suppliers. This specific webinar, part of it was inspired by the new FSMA rule that came out and requires that when you do your risk assessment, one of your preventive controls that you should be looking at is what we call a supply chain preventive control. And it puts the supply chain control up there with CCPs as far as their importance. This is one of the insights that FDA arrived at after investigating a few big food safety issues where buyers trusted their supplier without actually doing the work that had to be done to diligently see who they're working with, look at their paperwork, go visit them, and so forth. So this talks about good purchasing practices. So that's with the supply chain. Talking about cross-contact, controlling cross-contact, we actually be looking at a production plan. Of course, this is pretty trivial if you are making several products on the same line, and one of them contains an ingredient that is not in others, and it could be an allergen, then we should do it last before a big allergen clean. Allergen sanitation would include validation, monitoring, and verification. I also want to mention, again, FSMA and the rule for preventive controls for human food requires that one of our preventive controls, one being supply chain, just mentioned, other one is the allergen plan, our allergen plan, and also sanitation. So 3 out of 4, the fourth is the CCP. So there are 4 major preventive controls in FSMA: supply chain controls, allergen controls, sanitation controls, and CCPs, process controls. So there we get it. We have 3 out of 4 of them already. See here, looking at our controlling our allergen issues. Zoning and color coding is a big issue for preventing allergen cross-contact, and a lot of employee awareness. Employee awareness, again, I mentioned in the agricultural field. Same thing for food employees in the factories and in our industrial kitchens and our restaurants. Most people are not aware what's going on. It's not a matter of employee knowledge. They know, but they don't really understand. So, and again, I want to remind you that there's a difference between competence and awareness. Competence is knowing what to do, knowing the rules, being competent for them. Being awareness is understanding where that's coming from. And this is part of, and I did do a webinar also on that not long ago, talking about that specific difference. So you want to make sure that when you talk to people, you don't only tell them what to do and how to do it and make sure they're doing it, make sure they understand why they're doing it. And when we're talking about employee awareness, when we're talking about allergens, this is most important because of that. I don't believe allergens do that effect. One of the things that I do recommend doing with allergens is finding an organization in your country that of people who are allergen sufferers. They have organizations. These are NGOs, and often they will provide volunteers who are willing to come to food factories or to restaurants and to talk to the employees about their issues. And it's really, really effective. So you can have these volunteers. This will be a mother or a father of somebody who has a child who has an allergy, and they're willing to come and sit with the employees in little circles. There's no presentations, just little, just to talk and say, people, we put our child's life in your hands. You are amazing. When we read a label, we actually trust you with the life of our child, because I want to tell you what it's like to have a child that has a life-threatening allergy. You may not be aware of this. And when they talk to these people and talk to the employees and they hear this, instead of hearing from the QA manager or the specialist or the food technologist about the anaphylactic shock and about histamine and the mast cells and all that science that's really convincing, it's more convincing when you hear the story of somebody who is suffering. And so that's also a part of doing our awareness. Control packaging errors. Packaging errors, as I said, number 1 issue. Critical control at packaging material issuing step. At the point where we issue the packaging material, there should be a critical point. Call it a CCP, call it an OPRP, call it whatever you want, but it should be double checked. This is where it starts. Once the wrong package is issued, the mistake is going to be hard to detect. When I'm talking about issuing, I'm saying sending the packaging material from the warehouse to the production line. Automated optical control, very effective. This is part of what we call pokayoke. It makes idiot-proofing our packaging process. So what we'll do is, if you haven't been doing this, talk to your managers about it, talk to the team about it, is embedding into the packaging material a tiny QR code. You embed it in the packaging material itself. It is part of the print, and then putting an optical reader on the line. So every time a product goes past, it reads it and makes sure it's the right package. Because what will happen, sometimes somebody will put in a batch or a bunch or a handful of the wrong packaging material, and everything's moving so fast nobody can see it, and then you'll have a mispackaged product on the market. Somebody will buy it, find out the wrong product inside, and it will cause a recall, even though there are like 10, 20 of them. You don't know. So this will keep things what we call foolproof. Pokayoke in Japanese actually means foolproof. So the great systems now we have, things really advanced stuff. Differential design, and I'm going to finish with differential design. And this is a conversation that we should be having with our studio, with our design people. I'll show you an example. Okay, so look at this chocolate. These are 3 types of chocolate with different ingredients in them, and they look pretty similar to each other. If I'm working in that factory long enough, I may make a mistake and not be able to recognize it. But if I talk to my design people and say, how about we still keep the feel and the look of the product, we want brand identification, we want to be able to identify on the shelf, but we do want to have it more different than each other. And this is an argument that we have, because of course the first thing you learn in packaging branding is to have shelf presence, to have a brand that's recognizable. So then a lot of our different varieties look different. Now, if you have different varieties that don't have allergen differences between them, then it doesn't make a difference. It's the same thing. But if there are products that have, some of them have an allergen, some don't, it's just a matter of time when somebody's going to make a mistake when they look too much alike. So this is just an example of 2 different ways to design chocolate products with different ingredients in them. And with that, those are my 45 minutes of tips for preventing recalls due to undeclared ingredients. I'm going to activate my camera, and if anybody has any questions, I may be able to help.
Yeah, plenty of questions. Thanks very much, David. That was great. Dominic, we manufacture products that contain allergen. Oops.
Sorry, I did that. Can you?
Oh, right. Sorry. Dominic, we manufacture products that contain allergens, but due to the processing methods, the allergenic protein is not carried over into the finished product. We still label as containing allergens. We validate this, however, this feels futile as we know the allergenic properties have been removed. Do you recommend we continue to validate annually?
Yes, I mean, if I were in that, I don't have the whole story. This answer is not official, but just from that, it seems like there's no need to warn people about allergens to be validated. The protein's not there. It is worth doing revalidation. I don't think once a year would be enough. I would do it maybe once every few months until I feel more safe, and then lower the frequency when we feel that we're doing it right. But if I understood the question properly, I would continue to validate. But I don't. But if you are, if you still label it as containing allergens, then why validate it at all? That's something I'm not clear on. But I would not label it as containing and then make it more accessible to more people if it's safe.
Okay, makes sense. Question from Maud. In pet food, did you do that again, Dave? In pet food, what the allergen material requirements are and how can we manage them? Is it really like humans? We are FSC 22000 version 6.
Okay, that's a really interesting question, because we're not concerned in pets with allergic reactions that are severe, that are life-threatening. We're not concerned with that at all. Pets don't do that. They do get itchy, they get scratchy, they get diarrhea. So we do label the pet food as hypoallergenic when we use a single source of protein or use hydrolyzed protein. But the question is, and this is a question that has not been addressed yet by the food safety community, to the best of my knowledge, as I would have expected to be, about the potential of a presence of undeclared ingredient in the pet food that could affect the human pet parent. That's something that is not really addressed. So when people handle their pet's food, and maybe some gets into their mouth, maybe children, that's something that we're not looking at enough yet. And I think it's worth starting to think about, because we think about it with salmonella all the time. We're not concerned with salmonella in pet food because pets get salmonellosis. We're concerned with salmonella in pet food because humans are getting salmonellosis from their pet's pet food. They're not eating it. I mean, they may be eating it, but children can put it in their mouth. You get it on your hands. So it is something to think about. But we do not identify an anaphylactic shock situation. So so we're talking about the severity of the reaction. It's low grade usually.
Okay, good point. Tien, could you please help to advise suitable methods for testing sesame in frying oil, e.g. frying oil used to deep fry prawn toast, PCR or ELISA? Also about accuracy of both methods in the oil sample.
Okay, I don't feel qualified to answer that. That is an analytical question that if you don't get an answer, send me an email. I'll talk to our people at Mary Nutri-Sciences and I'll get you an answer. Because this is a technical issue of how much we can trust. I do know that sesame oil can have residue of sesame and should be tested, as opposed to soy oil, which is more refined and we're not concerned with. So refined soy oil we don't see as a potential allergen, but sesame and peanut oil we do. So from my experience, ELISA is a good system, but PCR may be better. I would not qualify enough to answer the question.
Okay, fair enough. Question from Tracy. Rio comments, the vital tool is not for everyone. What did you mean?
I mean that there are some organizations that say, I don't want to start thinking about how much I may have. I don't want to go there. In my risk assessment, I either have no allergens and I have separate lines, or I say may contain. Not every organization is comfortable with doing the mathematical calculation of that. I don't agree with them. I think it's a fine tool. But as I said, it is the prerogative of the risk assessment team to say, no, we're not doing this. We're not doing these calculations. We don't want to take that chance. That's what I meant.
Okay. A question from Letitia. I do not think vital tool can be used with EU legislation, or is it possible?
To the best of my knowledge, and again, I am not an EU regulation specialist, if you show that you've done a risk assessment using vital, and that is where you chose to label according to that, then it is acceptable to the auditor who is going to be inspecting your plant. That's because there is no EU regulation for may contain. It has an allergen, doesn't have an allergen. If you think that there may be residue, you are responsible for saying to warning, and in that case, according to regulation, it doesn't exempt you from from finding the best practices to prevent the allergen anyway, even though you're warning it.
Okay. Another question from Letitia. How can you remove a may contain from a finished product when you used an ingredient with a may contain? That
is exactly what Vital addresses. Vital addresses that question. Because what Vital is saying, this is a quantitative issue. So if at the end of the day I have a may contain in my ingredient that's X degree of that, and there's a calculation, there's an Excel sheet, there's a tool. If I'm afraid I may have a certain amount of undeclared allergen in the ingredient, I know how much of that ingredient is going to my final product, and I also know how much the final product is going to be consumed. That's also part of the calculation. I know how risky it is for that person, and it gives me levels of confidence. There's a 99%, 95% level of confidence in the calculation. So that's how I make my decision. I decide to say it does not have a warning on it. If somebody, and this is again, 99% confidence. So in the unlikely event that it does happen to somebody, that will be my defense.
Yeah. Got you. Question from Ahmed. What is allergen component in dairy products, lactose or whey, and casein in milk?
The allergen component in dairy products is the protein, not the lactose. That being said, we have to remember that there are people who are lactose intolerant. They don't have an allergy, just don't have the enzyme lactase. So they refrain from consuming products that contain lactose, and their friends. There's some overlap between them and people allergic to milk. But if you're allergic to milk, you cannot consume a product that that has milk but doesn't have lactose. If you're lactose intolerant, you can consume products that are milk dairy products that don't have lactose. There are a lot of them. All products that went through fermentation, all the cheeses that went fermented, and the lactose was all used up or artificially used up the lactose, you can eat them if you're lactose intolerant, but not if you have an allergy. On the other hand, if you're allergic to milk, you may be allergic to a certain milk. You may be able to consume dairy, goat milk, but not cow milk. If you're lactose intolerant, you can't consume either because they both have the same lactose. They're different between the protein. That's an interesting thing.
Okay, thank you. Question from Prasad. How can we identify the allergen or undeclared ingredients which come from flavors or colors or miscellaneous ingredients added to food?
Every single ingredient has to have its own risk assessment to see where it's coming from, what its supplier says, what their risk assessment says. It's a case-to-case basis. It's not specifically color or flavor. It could be anything. They all have the same rules.
Okay, question from Renata. We store third-party nut/peanut products in the warehouse, but do not manufacture them in production facility. Currently, the site has no restriction on what staff can bring in. Would you recommend restricting nuts and peanuts to be brought in on the site?
If it's possible, of course, I would recommend. If not, you should have a program in place to make sure that you have no potential cross contact with forklift trucks, with employees, with maintenance people walking around. So if you are storing them on your site, they should be stored separately. There should be color coding. There should be signage. We recommend using signs with pictures because not everybody understands all languages. Not everybody can read. So just make sure. If you can refrain from having them at all, it would be better. But if it's part of your operation, then you should manage it as a risk.
Yeah. Question from Elisa. Per your example of honey, as one would not ordinarily test honey for allergens, how was the milk allergen suspected and detected?
Unfortunately, somebody had an allergic reaction. There was an allergic reaction to a product, and then it was tested because they knew they were allergic to milk. They tested, they found the milk in the honey, and then they did testing of other products and found it in other places and did the trace back. That's how it was found.
Okay.
The person didn't die, by the way, which is good news.
Good.
Yes, they had their EpiPen with them.
Very good. Question from Rajesh. What percent or part per billion of allergen, if any, is allowed to be exempt from labeling due to agricultural commingling?
That would be a question to put through the vital test. Put it through the system, see what the vital calculation pops up. It's a mathematical question. Okay.
Question from Mohammed. Is there a public risk assessment scheme that can help me as a student to practice?
I don't know. Good question. I would consult your university that you're studying. If you are studying university as a student, food safety, I would ask your food safety professor.
Yeah. Okay. That's the last question, David. So
we're on time.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. It's good that we finished early because David's joined us. He's on a family get-together today, and he's kindly taken some time out to join us. So we do appreciate you taking the time, David.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure. And thank you all for listening. And if you have any more questions, we'll be happy. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah. You too. Enjoy your evening. Take care. Okay. I've loaded your certificate in the sidebar. Follow up in an hour or so with the recording slides and certificate. Thanks for joining today and making it such an engaging session with our friend David. We'll see you all next week. Take care.